Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Government. My name's Hannah White. I'm Director of the IFG, and I'm delighted that you're all here to join us today for this keynote speech by David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. David's been Labour MP for Tottenham since 2000, and he's going to speak today on how a Labour government would approach diplomacy and foreign policy. After he speaks, I'll put a few questions to him myself, and then I will turn to the room and to the very many people who I believe are joining us online. If you are online, you should find a panel on your screen for Slido. You can start sending in your questions via Slido, and they will pop up on my iPad. Indeed, I believe there are already questions for David coming in online. So we will move quickly, I think, to audience questions to make sure we get as many of those in as possible. So given the unsettled nature of the globe right now, we have live wars on Europe's doorstep, ongoing intractable conflicts around the world, humanitarian crises, and lots of problems which really need global cooperation to try to solve. So I'm sure you'll agree that as we approach the next election, it's really important for us all to understand what plans the official opposition has to deal with these issues and how it sees the UK's place in the world. So I'm sure you, like me, are very much looking forward to hearing what David has to say. David.
Well, thank you very much, Hannah, and it's an honour to speak today at the Institute for Government, which has done so much to improve not just the theory, but the practice of government. And if I have the privilege to serve as Britain's next Foreign Secretary, I will have had more time to prepare than any of my predecessors since Robin Cook. I've spent over 2 years shadowing the role, made almost 50 foreign visits, learning and exchanging with foreign ministers, leaders, diplomats, and thinkers. And I've learnt really from the truth-telling of Poland's Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski, to the WhatsApp diplomacy of Emmanuel Macron, and the dynamism of my friend Barbados's Prime Minister Mia Mottley. And I want to draw on the lessons that I've learnt, but first I want to dwell briefly on what becoming Foreign Secretary would mean to me personally. I believe that modern Britain is a story of progress. The great story of the 20th century is one where people without rights at the beginning of that century, from working people to women, to people of colour, to LGBT+ communities, winning through activism, representation, and argument. And as Foreign Secretary, any Foreign Secretary in this country can play a profound role in advancing and protecting those rights at home and abroad. Almost exactly 200 years ago, there was a debate in the House of Commons on the slave population of the West Indies. The Foreign Secretary, the legendary George Canning, rose first to discuss abolition. He spoke of a determination to look that evil in the face. William Wilberforce then took to the floor to denounce the flogging and branding of the enslaved. But before other members began to raise the horrors on the plantations, a Tory called Sir James Blair MP took to the floor. He said, "I deny that the Negroes there are in any respect harshly used. On the contrary, I maintain that they are as mildly and as humanely managed." He described the slaves as property to which owners are by law entitled. My own ancestors were among those possessions, slaves just outside Georgetown, the capital of Guyana. And let me tell you, if Labour wins the next election, and if Keir Starmer gives me the privilege of becoming Foreign Secretary, 200 years after Sir James's words, I will take the responsibility of being the first Foreign Secretary descended from the slave trade incredibly seriously. However, I don't intend to focus on the culture wars. I want to build on the lessons that we learn from the past, that enable us to work in partnership with the Commonwealth and the Global South, with respect and diplomacy, to address the problems of today and an era of conflict, the climate emergency, escalating humanitarian crisis on every continent, the great task of extending and defending progress, and against a darkening geopolitical horizon, we shall deliver this not through symbolic gestures, but through hard, painstaking diplomacy. Of course, diplomacy depends above all on people. FCDO staff, many of whom I've had the pleasure of meeting over the past 2 years, are the essential ingredient of British diplomacy. And they're looked upon enviously by many other countries, travelling across the world from Brazil to Kenya, from the occupied Palestinian territories to Ukraine. I've been hugely impressed by their knowledge, professionalism and bravery, often in incredibly difficult circumstances. And I've seen how effective we can be when our tools, diplomacy, development, defence, work together in unison. So whether you focus on development or diplomacy, security or prosperity, consular or crisis response, whether you work in King Charles Street or in one of the 281 missions overseas, whether you are a country-based or posted overseas, I know that this is a profession, for many of you, a vocation, unlike almost any other. The demands can be extraordinary, the public scrutiny intense, the personal cost significant to you and your families, and I thank you for your service. Because at its best, this institution can achieve so much. It has achieved so much. George Mitchell, the great American peacemaker, said diplomacy was 700 days of failure and 1 of success. The nature of the business is that gains are often invisible or quickly forgotten. But there are many moments, even in the quarter century that I've spent in politics, which continue to shape our world. From Tony Blair and Robin Cook's heroic work around the war in Kosovo and the sustained efforts across the Balkans since, the restoration of democracy in Sierra Leone against all the odds, setting up the first forced marriage unit in the UK to help British victims abroad, the London summit in 2009 when Gordon Brown gathered together world leaders and pulled the global financial system back from the brink, the Olympic Games in 2012, a multicultural vision of modern Britain, a diplomatic success shared across the whole of Whitehall, but with its origins in the work of my friend Tessa Jowell. And over the last 2 years, everything you have done in Ukraine to defend a democracy, from Vladimir Putin's new form of fascism. Politicians may sometimes get the credit, but I know full well that it is the work of civil servants tolling behind the scenes that makes these successes happen. And I know also that the last 5 years have been marked by disruption after disruption. The painfully botched merger between 2 departments, an endless carousel of Conservative foreign secretaries, each with their own priorities and peccadillos, each of whom have failed to deliver for the United Kingdom. So I'd like to reassure you that I have no interest whatsoever in change for change's sake. If I have the honour to become Foreign Secretary, my focus will be on delivering concrete gains for the British people. And my objective for the FCDO as an institution is that you are universally acknowledged, not only as the best diplomatic service in the world, but also the one driven by the clearest sense of purpose. Last year, I set out a vision of Britain reconnected in a Fabian's pamphlet, reconnected for security, for prosperity, for climate, for development, and for diplomacy. Over the last 14 years of Tory chaos, Britain has lost influence over international decision-making. We still have incredible assets, a permanent UN Security Council membership, compelling soft power personified by our arts, culture and creative industries, the English language, business and legal sectors which penetrate every single continent, world-leading capabilities in science, technology and advanced manufacturing, universities to which the most able and ambitious students and researchers from around the world continue to flock, alongside the excellence of our diplomats and armed forces. But all of these institutions and sectors have suffered from, at best, a lack of focus, and at worst, political delinquency. I can't begin to imagine the embarrassment faced by those ambassadors forced to transmit overnight aid cuts to their hosts. The foolishness of Rishi Sunak becoming the first Prime Minister in a decade to skip the UN General Assembly. The short-sightedness of Boris Johnson's Brexit without a plan. The trauma of explaining Liz Truss's budget, or her failure to recognise the French president as our friend, not our foe. And this period of looking inwards came at the worst possible time. The past 10 years have seen the most significant geopolitical shifts since 1989. The Middle East in its worst turmoil since 1973, with humanitarian catastrophes not only in Gaza, but also in Yemen and Sudan. The climate crisis accelerating away from our efforts to contain it. Revolutionary technologies at risk of racing ahead of our capacity to regulate them or to harness the opportunities they bring. A return to superpower competition without the quad rails of the Cold War. China veering increasingly close to throwing its lot in with Putin. The Kremlin waging war within Europe's borders and manoeuvring Iran, North Korea and Syria to support its aims. The rise of a host of new powers able to shape their own reality and maintain multiple shifting allegiances. The peril, of course, of Ukraine facing a Russian army that outnumbers and outguns it, the horrors of the Middle East still without a two-state solution, the jeopardy of the rules-based order on which Britain depends collapsing. This is an historic inflection point, a moment crying out for energetic diplomacy to match it. I argue in a Foreign Affairs article last month that the next Labour foreign policy doctrine should be progressive realism, taking the world as it is, not as we would wish it to be, dealing head-on with a worsening security environment, starting, unfortunately, from a position of low growth, weak productivity, and insufficient investment. But believing that we can get Britain its future back while delivering for the wider world. In government, the how matters just as much as the what. Labour's Foreign Office will have 5 guiding principles. First, we must have clarity of purpose. We will make the FCDO the international delivery arm of Keir Starmer's missions. That means, above all else, delivering growth and jobs, addressing the climate and nature emergency, and defending UK's security in an era in which domestic and international policy have drawn ever closer. It is diplomacy that creates the long-term strategic partnerships which will drive investment into cutting-edge industries in the UK, from chip design to biotech to electrical vehicle plants. It is diplomacy through Labour's plans for a clean power alliance that will help bring more countries onto the net zero trajectory. It is diplomacy through Labour's proposed UK-EU security pact that will protect Europe from Russia's threats. And it is diplomacy through reform of the United Nations, the IMF and the World Bank that can revitalise the faltering international system. In all of these cases, our domestic leadership and international impact are inseparable. And so if we win the election, I want every ambassador and embassy demonstrating clearly how they are delivering growth to the UK economy, how they are delivering security to the British people, and how they are helping drive the low-carbon transition. The last Labour government drove up standards in domestic policy through a relentless focus on monitoring and evaluation. Yes, foreign policy is different, but we should place greater emphasis on delivering tangible outcomes to demonstrate diplomacy's impact. Second, our diplomacy needs to rediscover the art of grand strategy. We need to set out our own efforts, not only in the context of our closest comparators, such as the French, whose economic diplomacy can often feel more hard-headed and realist than our own, but G7 nations such as the US and Japan. We also need to address the sometimes learn from the increasingly dynamic diplomacy approaches of countries like India, Brazil, and the UAE. Lasting security demands long-termism. The last Labour government upgraded the then policy planners function into an expanded strategy unit. Countries that execute international strategy effectively, from the US to Singapore, place a huge emphasis on such functions. But at present, neither the FCDO nor the National Security Council is delivering the sharp, coherent international strategy which the country urgently needs. Without such strategy, we should expect to be buffeted by the tides of superpower competition, not only between the United States and China, but also by the many rising powers who are threatening our competitive advantages economically and militarily. We will build up and empower the existing strategy unit to put it at the heart of the organisation, making it a place to go for the sharpest geopolitical minds. Third, technology. Diplomacy is not a luxury. It helps partnerships to evolve, nations to thrive, and crises to evaporate before they reach the news cycle. But we cannot meet the disruptive challenges of the 2020s with a 20th century diplomatic playbook. In an era of fiscal constraint, we need to work smarter, adapt our tools, and make better use of technology. We should cut the time spent by staff in King Charles Street compiling biographies and background briefings. We should make better use of existing resources to ensure that as many staff as possible are working in the field. The FCDO should be doubling down on adopting AI and other emerging tech to generate insights and to free up staff to concentrate on frontline activity. Recent events from Gaza to Ukraine have demonstrated, for example, the huge gains available through open source intelligence. Given the capabilities within the country, the FCDO should be at the front of the pack in developing open source and analytical capability. In Kyiv this week, I was alerted by 3 air raid sirens in just one day. I saw firsthand how indispensable open source intelligence is to Ukrainian decision-making as they fight back against the Russian advance. This is why Labour will drive the integration of emerging technology and diplomacy. We also need to recognise that diplomacy and development no longer operate within the old institutional boundaries. On my travels, I've encountered countless organisations and individuals from businesses to the arts who can act as powerful, informal advocates for the national interests. But too often, they're not invited to do so. And this is particularly true of the arts and creative industries, which government has treated with tremendous disrespect. The next Labour government will establish a soft power council, which brings together leading figures from across the arts, culture, creative industries and academia to work together with the British Council, the BBC World Service, to advance the national interests. We've seen this work before in campaigns that we had, for example, for the London 2012 Olympics. We can do it again. And fourth, openness. I know that there has been significant progress over the past few years, but there does remain a persistent view of the FCDO as remote and elitist. I don't think that's a fair reflection, but this is an image which we must lose. This geopolitical moment requires fresh ideas. The FCDO needs to be out and about in the UK as well as overseas, talking to business, academia, think tanks, and the rest of Whitehall, leading the debate on the UK's role in the world and demonstrating that it welcomes challenge and argument. The root of diplomatic expertise will always be an understanding of host countries and regions, but the emerging diplomatic issues of our age are the thematic threats and opportunities presented by climate, technology and health. For too long, the Foreign Office has been seen by the outside world and the rest of government as generalist dilettantes. Once again, Michael Gove was wrong. In a modernised Foreign Office, as in wider government, we need more experts, not fewer. If the Foreign Office is to change the global debate on technology, then we need serious technology experts. If we are to understand China, we need Chinese experts, both here and in Beijing. And if we're to shift the dial on nature, we need people who really understand the natural world. Openness also means considering how and where we can generate the biggest bang for our buck with our diplomatic network. In a time of fiscal restraint, we should not just accept that the traditional model of an embassy works in every country. We should consider collaboration with our key partners when that provides a means of expanding into new areas. For example, in the Pacific Islands Forum nations, where climate change and great power competition intersect most sharply. Finally, excellence. William Hague was right to create the Diplomatic Academy and revive the language school. But that was more than a decade ago, and a new generation of diplomatic excellence requires a new institution to support it. Let us upgrade it to a new college of British diplomacy that sets the global gold standards for both diplomacy and development. It should draw on best practice and talent from across the world, not just British expertise, but learning from the innovations made by our allies and partners, not least from our Ukrainian friends in their pioneering defence against a hostile state. It should open its doors not only to all of Whitehall, but also to international diplomats from friendly countries. It would offer courses in core skills such as languages and history, but it should also teach the key diplomatic issues of the future, such as climate science and AI. And it would also have the same relentless focus on delivery that Michael Barber pioneered in the last Labour government, which drove up standards and outcomes across vast swathes of domestic policy. The college will be cost neutral, financed through charging overseas diplomats for courses, but also through generating partnerships with the private sector in much the same way as institutions such as the Blattevnik School of Government. Many foreign secretaries of the past have encouraged the office to be more creative and to embrace risks. I believe that one such initiative asked staff to think up ways of scratching the Rolls-Royce, but vanishingly few marks were made. I hope my words today have begun to describe a different future, strategic, open, innovative, and technology-enabled. A new great British vehicle, perhaps an electric one, but above all driven by a compelling sense of mission. I believe that my lineage tells a story, that modern Britain and the modern world has been a story of progress. Progress that is the result of politics, progress that comes out of diplomacy, progress that advances through policy and strategy. No matter how complex or difficult the task, I know you will rise to the challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. That's plenty to get our teeth into there, I think. As you might expect, I'm going to start with a very IFG question about the FCDO and where it's come from and where it might be going under a future Labour government. You criticised the merger of DFID and the FCDO as botched, and you said you wouldn't want to engage in change for change's sake, and I think anyone who's engaged in machinery of government changes can attest that nobody would enter into change for its own sake. There'd have to be a really good rationale for it. So I'm just interested in what you make of the underpinning question of whether foreign policy and diplomacy work best for a country when they are handled together, or those who say actually they're separate, they should be handled better separately?
Well, look, machinery of government is absolutely the purview of the Prime Minister of the day. And I think my colleague Lisa Nandy said that we will come forward before the election with a view on the machinery of government issues. But I do think it's clear, and we all agree, that for the United Kingdom, diplomacy and development must be aligned. And I think we can see with the crisis in Ukraine, where we're spending over £200 million worth of aid at this time. And I saw this week with children who had been kidnapped from Ukraine into Russia and fortunately found and brought back, the importance of that aid at this time. And of course, we can also see in Gaza the importance of aligning diplomacy and aid. So I'll leave it for Keir Starmer to make that call in the weeks and months ahead as we head up to the general election.
Okay. Talking about Keir Starmer, you talked about what you would see as the FCDO's mission role in taking a future Labour government's missions forward. Is there implicit in that argument that you feel that foreign policy has become too detached from domestic priorities in recent years? And if that is the case, practically speaking, what would you do to rejoin them?
Well, first and foremost, it's about political focus. And it's self-evident that the next government, and I hope, of course, it's a Labour government, is relentlessly focused on growth. And so the Foreign Office and our officials must be relentlessly focused on delivering that growth. And it's often the diplomatic community, parts of the Gulf, the United States, of course, the European Union, that will be delivering that growth. And on areas like climate, we have to be absolutely at the centre when we talk about a clean power alliance. Obviously, all of us, many of us, hugely concerned at this backward step that we saw from Rishi Sunak at the point of UNGA last year. So in a whole host of areas, on AI, on climate, on rare earth minerals, we have to be front and centre focused, and it's that alignment that I want to see from the FCDO. And I think it's important that wherever you are in the 281 missions abroad, it's important that our ambassadors and staff can really demonstrate how they are delivering on that core objective. That's what we owe in the FCDO to the British people.
You talked also about you've got your 5 principles for how an FCDO under Labour would run, and your 5th one I think was around sort of excellence, and you've talked about this idea of a College of British Diplomacy. Is that something that should be restricted to the FCDO? Would Labour actually be interested in the idea of recreating a national school for government, which would have benefits across the civil service more generally? And stepping even beyond that, do you think that actually training for ministers as well as for civil servants is something that Labour ought to prioritise? I'm not arguing because Labour in particular need it, but just the IFG's view is that being a minister is an incredibly difficult job, and anyone doing a difficult job ought to expect professional development and support.
I think that David Cameron can always learn. Look, I think that what's absolutely clear is that this moment that we're in at the moment, this hugely, vastly changing moment, calls on us to really think hard about what I described as grand strategy. It's commensurate with the period after the Second World War, when Britain was losing an empire, when much of Britain lay in rubble, when the Marshall Plan delivering for West Germany was so important, and we had to play a role in that, and where Ernest Bevin was deeply realist about us setting up NATO and about the importance of the nuclear deterrent. That's grand strategy, and we need to get that back. And I don't think anyone in this room really believes that we've cracked that yet. And part of that is learning and thinking and expertise. I'm quite sure that there are brilliant minds in the FCDO and amongst our ambassadors and diplomats across the world. But we need to be relentlessly engaged in the business of strategy and how. We need to share that, often with our allies and with friendly countries. I think there are ways that we can make revenue from that. And also, look, I looked at the IFG and most recently I've seen Margaret Beckett and Jack Straw reflecting on their periods in office. There's so much collectively that we can utilise. It seems to me that this is the moment to step up in relation to what I call that new college of British diplomacy, and to find ways to combine strategy and delivery and share that with other allies and partners across the world.
And ministers?
Well, ministers at the moment can learn a language if they want to and can find the time to. So, of course, there may well be courses that they can benefit in.
Great. You talked about emerging issues of our time, climate, technology, health. You also mentioned Tesla and electric cars. In this world in which big multinational countries sometimes have a turnover larger than that of certain states, do you think diplomacy and government needs to look beyond nation states into how that new emerging corporate world is affecting these questions that the FCDO has to answer?
Look, of course, if you're in a big corporate, you're thinking about the thematic challenges of energy. You're thinking about and setting up an AI unit within your organisation, and you're really reflecting on how that's going to give you corporate opportunities, but also it might challenge some of your employees and your competitive business model. You're absolutely wanting to align your profit with the climate emergency and some of your strategic goals in relation to decarbonising. All of that is going on in any corporate centre as I sit here. And of course it's got to be going on across government and in diplomacy, because these thematic challenges that are with us are very, very central. They're as central as the sort of Fordism that we saw at the beginning of the last century. They're as central as the big themes I talked about in the 20th century. As women, for example, gained rights, as working people gained education, opening up to new possibilities in the economy and productivity. These are important themes that, of course, affect diplomacy and the way we pursue diplomacy, which mean that they're independent of geographic expertise. So, of course, there's focus in any Foreign Office on geographic expertise, but there must be that thematic focus as well. And at the moment, quite a lot of foreign policy is being done in other parts of Whitehall. There needs to be a little bit of corralling of that for the national effort. And it's important that the Foreign Office is at the centre of that dispersed ability to understand those thematic objectives.
I mean, that makes me reflect that, in fact, quite a lot of ODI at the moment is being spent by the Home Office.
Too much. I mean, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary that we didn't just cut the budget from one day to the next, but such a significant proportion of it, billions, is being spent effectively on housing refugees in hotels. And I think it's done tremendous damage to our reputation abroad.
Do you think that the way in which government thinks about immigration, migration, needs to be thought about more broadly, not just within the context of the Home Office?
Well, look, I mean, I sat in Thurrock this time yesterday, and Keir Starmer outlined our approach to immigration. And the focus was on the gangs. The focus was on a new national border command and the need to properly process, the need to work much closer with partners. And I've sat with Keir Starmer and Ursula von der Leyen and our European friends, often raising their real concerns about the Horn of Africa, a lack of jobs, climate driving migration. These are issues on which we've got to work together.
Okay, I'm going to give up my right to ask more questions and turn to the floor. My colleague Lauren is fetching the roving mic. Please could you let us know who you are and where you're from. If you have an affiliation, can you come down here in the front, please, Lauren? Thank you. Well, two or three questions at a time to start with.
Morning, thank you. James Landell, BBC. David, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, says that Donald Trump should be called out as a racist, sexist, homophobe. You call Mr. Trump misunderstood. I mean, I wonder if you could just respond to that, and also just talk more broadly about the policy towards the United States at the moment. Is there a risk that you end up falling between two stools, that you end up upsetting those people who know that Donald Trump does not share Labour values, but also those on the Republican right who think that at the moment perhaps your approach is a little bit too much, that actually that's not the response that Donald Trump likes?
Great. And there's two more down here at the front, I think.
Thank you, David. Stefan Boscher from Politico Playbook. Just wanted to follow up from that question to say, firstly, was Sadiq wrong to say those comments? Is he incorrect in his assessment? And then secondly, you talked about how we're living in an epochal moment across the world, and that we, in a post-World War II moment. Considering that, why hasn't Labour committed to the Tories' 2030 defence spending pledge?
Great. And the lady behind.
Hi, Claire Ellicott from the Daily Mail. You mentioned how difficult aid cuts were. Would Labour restore 0.7% spending? And also would Labour be able to strike a US trade deal with Donald Trump in the White House? And do you regret some of your comments about him in the past and worry that that would imperil any potential trade deal? Thanks.
There's a lot of questions on Donald Trump. So let me just take those questions together. Look, it has been my privilege to be in parts of the world and to be alongside people who I would really describe as heroes in this global moment. I was in Ukraine this week, sitting with young people who have lost their parents, who have been taken from Ukraine to Russia, who have been told by Russian authorities that Ukraine is finished, that they are now Russian. There's almost an attempt to brainwash them. I have stood with relatives of those who were massacred at Bucha, and I was standing in Irpin with those who resisted the Russian tanks and stopped them going into Kyiv. This is a profoundly serious moment, and it requires seriousness. And that seriousness means that the special relationship between the United Kingdom and our American friends is core not just to our own national security, but security of much of the world. And so, just like Wilson, Nixon, Blair Bush, whoever is in the White House in a big election year in the United States, or whoever is in number 10 in a big election year in our own country, of course we must work together. Now, look, the truth is that you're going to be hard-pressed to find any politician, particularly politicians who were on the backbenches, who haven't had something to say about Donald Trump. I think David Cameron, he actually wrote a book about him, or put him in his book. So his was a really considered thought, and he described him as xenophobic and misogynistic. So that's what it is. But I take very seriously the responsibility of being on the front bench and the responsibility of finding common cause on behalf of the national interests of this country. And whether it's in relation to our national security or the growth that our economy needs, I am crystal clear that that is our objective if we have the privilege of forming the next government. On the aid question, we've said that we want to get back to 0.7 as soon as the fiscal environment allows. Rachel Reeves has been absolutely clear about the need to manage our economy effectively and seriously, and therefore the phrase, as soon as the fiscal climate allows, is important. And of course, we get to make the assessment properly of the books if we have the privilege to serve, but I'm not intending to cut across the good work that she is doing. And in my travels to the United States, it feels pretty clear to me that America has set its face against trade deals. That's not particular to the United Kingdom, but the political establishment, both Democrat and Republican, is not focused on trade deals at this time. And therefore, I think, unless that changes, we would be expending a lot of effort unnecessarily. We have been absolutely clear that we want a defence and strategic review that begins on day one in office. We get to look at the books in that environment. We're committed to the $3 billion to Ukraine and the ongoing funding, and we're absolutely committed to 2.5% of GDP, again, as soon as the fiscal environment allows. Let me be clear, though, when we left office, we were spending 2.5% on GDP. Under this government, we've seen our armed forces reduced to the smallest since the Napoleonic era. We've got real issues around kit for our armed services, around housing and the quality of housing for our armed services. So there's a lot to do, but we're absolutely committed to the burden sharing that is required. And just to, what I said, by the way, about Donald Trump being misunderstood, I was talking specifically about European defence. I think it is important to put on record that under Donald Trump, actually, the United States NATO contribution increased, the United States commitment to troops in the European family increased. He sent the first javelins to Ukraine. He, in his own unique way, I think is concerned about burden sharing across Europe. That is a concern that was shared by my friend Barack Obama. It is a concern that has been echoed since Kennedy. And it's the right concern because it is still the case that there are European countries not spending as much as they should on defence. And that needs to improve, and that is something where the United Kingdom can join common cause with the United States.
Okay, I've managed to find you some questions online that don't relate to Trump. The highest up-rated questions, if you're watching online, you can give a thumbs up to the questions you think most need to be asked. So we have a question from Ashley Sutton. What are Labour's plans in terms of youth mobility? It feels like Labour's response to the EU proposal some weeks back was unclear, and this concerns many of us students. And then a question from Tim Cole. Many diplomats, like me, left the FCDO because of Brexit. Many DFID officials left because of the failed merger. Will a clearer focus on goals and outcomes be sufficient to restore FCDO morale, or is structural change needed? Well, you have those two, and then I shall come back to the room.
Well, look, clearly, the next election is an opportunity to turn the page on the post-Brexit rancor of the past and the low point at which a UK Prime Minister described the French President as an enemy, in which we had an integrated review in which Europe was barely mentioned. And actually, I thought it was most peculiar that it took more than 18 months in office for Rishi Sunak to actually visit our friends and allies in Berlin. This is extraordinary. I want to get back to structured dialogue with the European Union on the issues that matter. I mentioned in my speech a UK-EU security pact, which in every single capital in Europe, there's a positive reaction to Labour's proposal in that area. We have the review of the TCA next year. So look, we will get into negotiation if we have the privilege of serving, and we're not naive. Of course, there are always trade-offs with the European Union, but we will approach those conversations in a positive manner. And let me just say that the sentiment of the question was clearly a sense of low morale as a consequence of exiting the European Union. We had a very, very messy divorce. It was a divorce that went on for years. It was only really with the Windsor Framework, more recently, that we sorted out custody of the children. We need to get back on trusted, friendly terms. And I believe a Labour government can do that. Building, as I say, that trust back with a UK-EU security pact and approaching the TCA review in a positive environment, where I think when I speak to European colleagues that they recognise the key challenges around war in the continent, the key challenges around energy and climate and over-dependency of unfriendly states particularly. And they also recognise in a period of low growth across Europe that there are opportunities for us continuing to work together. So that's the spirit into which we enter discussions with our European partners. And of course, it's been very important for me to visit Brussels, France, Berlin, other partners across the continent to build and rebuild those relationships.
Any specific thoughts on youth mobility?
That's part of the discussions that we'll enter into. We have been clear about free movement and the single market particularly.
Okay, let's go back to the room for some more questions. Gentleman here on the aisle.
My name is Aidar Mardenov. I'm a consular from Kazakhstan embassy. If Labour wins the election, will your approach to foreign policy on Central Asia, particularly on Kazakhstan, change? If so, in what specific areas? Thank you.
Okay, and if you come down the aisle, Lauren, that.
Thanks. Alexander Evans, London School of Economics. You set out a lot more detail on your proposals for the internal machinery of the Foreign Office, including openness to Britain and to the rest of Whitehall. Will you change tack in terms of openly recruiting ambassadors from beyond the civil service and the diplomatic service?
And then if you pass it to the lady in front of you. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to, Sophia Gaston from Policy Exchange. I just want to ask a question about China. I would be very interested to hear any thoughts on priorities for the UK-China relationship and where some compromises might have to be made.
Okay.
I was very pleased that one of the last acts I was able to make in the last Labour government as Minister for Higher Education was a visit that I was able to make to Kazakhstan and to see the opening up there was in Kazakhstan at that time. I am worried about darker clouds hovering over that region as a consequence of Vladimir Putin. I haven't been able to get back to the region over the last 2.5 years, but believe me, it is on my agenda and the agenda of my colleague, Stephen Doughty, who leads for us on Europe particularly, so not forgotten. I think that the emphasis I placed in my speech was on the skill set that I do believe is important. So it's really about having the right people in the right places, the right skills in the right places. And I am very interested at this time where we do need to support our efforts for growth, that we have the right competencies, particularly around economic diplomacy. And so you've got to have the right skills for diplomacy, of course, but I do believe that across Whitehall, we've got many of those skills, and it may be that beyond Whitehall, we've got the right skills with the appropriate training. So I've got an open mind in this area, and it's certainly something I'd want to discuss in greater detail if we have the privilege of winning the next election. I'm minded a bit, and I make no apologies, in a sense, for being hugely informed and persuaded by what the Tony Blair government did while I was part of it, obviously, in the domestic arena. So in driving up standards in education, driving up standards in policing, setting up colleges, bringing in expertise from outside, having quite a rigorous targeted approach, but making sure you had the right requisite skills if you were going to drive up standard of, say, inner city schools in London. I don't think that those should be solely the preserve of domestic politics. There are things to learn, I think, in relation to foreign affairs as well, particularly at such a challenging geopolitical environment. On China, we've said that we would begin an audit right across Whitehall on coming into office. That is really important. You know, what we've seen from this government on China, I mean, on last count, it was about 7 different approaches. From the golden era of David Cameron and George Osborne to Liz Truss's approach, which was, you know, saw China as a hostile state, effectively, to the approach of Boris Johnson. I'm not sure where his position was, it moved around. And then we've got backbenchers like Ian Duncan Smith, Tory grandees like Chris Patten. We've had a lot of different approaches to China. And what I think we need is a sustained approach that can be maintained, certainly over the course of a decade. That's what's respected, and that's what we need to get to. I'm guided by the 3 C's that I set out, that there are areas on which we will compete, there are areas on which we must challenge, and we have a different view, and there are areas, of course, where we must cooperate if we can, health, climate, for example, that sort of area.
Okay. More questions, Mr.
Thanks. Lama Shahadi from The National. So can the UK have better relations with the Gulf than it currently has? And you wrote in your paper that the US failure to police the red line against the use of chemical weapons in Syria didn't just entrench Assad, it also emboldened Putin to annex Crimea. So should the UK have intervened in Syria in 2013?
Behind you. Thanks.
Thank you. Matthew Holhurst from The Economist. So two questions, really. I mean, do you have any sort of specific ideas on how to build up expertise? I mean, you mentioned sort of data and economic diplomacy. Building up expertise has been a goal of successive administrations, and people have always struggled to break down the generalism. Do you have any sort of specific plans for that? And secondly, more broadly, how you sort of set out a long critique and a shopping list of things you'd like to change at the FCDO. How far do you and your shadow cabinet colleagues sort of worry more broadly about the capacity of Whitehall to deliver your missions? Is what you're saying today part of a broader critique that you worry about, you know, the state of the machine of the Rolls-Royce or other cars are available, like that you're going to inherit? Thank you.
Just over there.
Hello, Simon Fraser, Flint Global, former PUS in the Foreign Office. And actually this links a bit to the last question. I very much welcome your sort of the vision you set out for the Foreign Office, in particular the sense of needing strategic purpose and delivering on behalf of the whole of government. But my sense is, from my own experience, that the Foreign Office has not always been very good at relating to the rest of government, at working Whitehall very effectively. And I wondered, in relation to that, if you could just comment on two things. First of all, what is your thinking about the relationship with the sort of National Security Council structure at the centre and that machinery that is around the Prime Minister, which is so powerful and which the Foreign Office has to deal with? And secondly, in relation to European policy, what is your view on the extent to which that should be led from the Foreign Office or led across government from the centre? Thank you.
A few good IFG questions there.
I set out in my Foreign Affairs article that we absolutely have to work with the Gulf. This is hugely important. I think for security in the Middle East, it's important in relation to our economic and growth missions, and it's one of the reasons why I have been to Qatar, to UAE, to Saudi Arabia several times whilst I have held this role. I'm hugely concerned that at this time of speaking, the UAE and the United Kingdom, because of this government and missteps in this government, seem to have relations at an all-time low. That is not acceptable, and it is not in the UK's national interests that that should be the case. We will seek to repair that if we have the opportunity to serve. I think it's important for ministers to set a strategic objective and ambition. I hope I was articulate as I could be in the speech I just gave about AI, and I hope that you'll understand that in a fiscally constrained environment, I think that that is a huge opportunity for us to free up civil servants from some of the work that we've taken as the norm to do other work, particularly in the field, that's absolutely essential. It will be quite properly in conversation with the PermSec and the top team in the Foreign Office on those deliverables. But I suspect we will have to reach quite far into some of the learning that comes from business and industry as well, to really make sure that we are making the most of what is a fast-moving technological advance and having that expertise. the point, Simon, and it links to the other point made about bandwidth, if you like, the bandwidth of foreign policy is being stretched across much of the Western world, which means that the need to focus on priorities are essential. And it does mean, I think, for us in the UK, that we have to get the balance right between, if you like, the securocrats and the security approach, but also the economic approach. And so, of course, these things are under consideration by Keir Starmer and his team in conversation with myself to make sure that the next government has the appropriate architecture, particularly on the economic side, as well as the security side. And that's, of course, working with Treasury colleagues and looking closely at the Cabinet Office functions as we move forward. I don't think I can say much more on that because it's a conversation that should probably be had by the leader of the party, I think, in working out the best balance that's fit for all the government he wants to direct in partnership with myself, Rachel Reeves and others.
Just to push on that point that Simon raised about the FCDO and its relationship with the rest of Whitehall, without going into without thinking about machinery of government changes which might be envisaged, how will you go about addressing? I think that's quite a common critique of the FCDO, that it is too insular and not sufficiently connected into the rest of Whitehall. Yes, it's definitely something that I am reflecting on, that I take on board. It's why I made the observation that foreign policy has been done in lots of different places in Whitehall and needs some coherence. It's why I've placed quite a lot of emphasis on economic diplomacy, and that means having the right personnel in the right places. And I'm acutely aware that I am sadly inheriting a department where morale, Foreign Office used to have very high morale. I'm afraid it has been at a low ebb. It's got slightly better in the last couple of years, but it's got some way to go. And part of that is having its confidence within Whitehall. And so I am very aware of that context. Okay, unfortunately, I know there were a lot more questions, but we have to draw this to a close. So I hope you'll join me in thanking David for a really fascinating hour. Thank you.